think we're live.
Oh, did you do the countdown thing?
I might not have done the countdown thing. I don't know if I know how. Sorry. Here we are. We might be live, John. I'm going to go away.
You sound like an osprey to me. All right. Okay, so Kathy Sue, you see my post, but no picture, no video, no audio. Cheers. All right. Well, with no audio and no picture and no video, there's not much point in going further. Aaron, are you still there, buddy? Aaron?
I'm here. Why would they not be able to see us? That's a problem.
Kathy Sue, can you see us now? Can you? She says, "Love now." Oops, live now. Okay, we love you too, Kathy, and we're ready to go. All right. Okay, we're good.
And I think you're live. I'm gonna pop Seeds of Destruction on this screen here.
I got you. I got the book right here. It's called Seeds of Destruction: The Hidden Agenda of Genetic Manipulation by F. William Engdahl. A book I read about a year ago on the channel, on my original channel, McDuff Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. Just checking to see where this was published in 2007, and it's like a roadmap of where we've been taken in our just horrific food policy. It's something that is tragic and unbelievably depressing to face what they have done. But it's the same people. It is the same people that do everything that we have to report on here on McDuff channel. It's always the same. All right. So Seeds of Destruction. And it's seeds of destruction. It's instead of seeds of growth, seeds being the metaphor for beginning, the mustard seed that all faith comes out of, grows like a mustard seed. Everything grows out of seeds, but now they've fashioned seeds that do the opposite, that destroy and that kill. And it's a story that nobody really wants to hear. But William Engdahl faces up to these things in so many of his great books. So let's get into it and learn what we can, remember what we can, and take it very seriously, because this is about life itself. I want to begin. Yes, and hello everybody. Great to have you here. Hi, David. And Kathy, Michael, Ezra, good to have you here. Let me begin. One of the people that it seems to be is always in my readings and in my studies is George F. Kennan, Kennan. And George F. Kennan is of the same generation with Allen Dulles, and he grew up in that conservative, pro-Republican, upper class, WASP elite, and he worked for Jacob Schiff, and he was an intellectual, basically, that wrote stuff like the Long Telegram, which is a very famous piece of work that actually is relied upon by the Dulles brothers and by Eisenhower and all of the conservative establishment for the domino theory, for the containment policy, for the idea that we have got to divide the world into us and them, and we have got to contain the Soviet Union. There he is, George F. Kennan. So, okay. Now, World War II. Think about the background that we've studied about how the Nazis were financed, at least in part, by Wall Street. The Sullivan and Cromwell connection, the Prescott Bush connection, the Union Banking, the Schroeder Bank, and the 120, what street was it? 120 Wall Street building, I think, where all of these things worked together, and it all really does fall under the Rockefeller projects. So when Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, right, in June of 1941, he just completely, just uh, completely breaks the Molotov Pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact that divided Poland and said Russia and Germany won't fight. Well, he decides, well, we're going to invade Russia, and this is Operation Barbarossa, and this is when, going into Lithuania, going into the Baltics, into Moldova and White Russia, the Belarusian area of which Minsk is the capital. So many Jews were rounded up and just murdered. Not only Jews, though, also captured Soviet soldiers. And there was something that I wanted to quote from Hitler when he issued an order, that's famous order called the Commissar Order. And the Commissar Order said that if you capture any of the political commissars that are attached, to the Soviet army, they had officers and then they had commissars, right? If you catch any of them, you are to execute them, just kill them. And in discussing the reasons why, Hitler says, we cannot in this battle act in a knightly fashion. Okay? We can't act in a knightly fashion. This is a racial and ideological conflict that must be fought ruthlessly. Okay? And that is the moral justification for the genocide of the Jews and the Gypsies and everybody else that they felt was, in the way or racially inferior or inferior in some other way. Well, I keep that in mind, that Commissar Order. You can't do it like with chivalry. You can't be chivalrous, right? When I think of this guy, George Kennan's quote that begins William Engdahl's book, Siege of Destruction, and I'm going to read this to you. It's a quote from George F. Kennan, U.S. State Department senior planning official in 1948. And here's his comment. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. Unquote. So you see what I'm saying? This is the same mindset. And sadly, it comes from Wall Street as much as it comes from Berlin or London or wherever you want to name. It comes from a mindset of a Bertrand Russell who, basically will tell you, hey, there's no God, there's no hereafter, and just, get what you can. And You know, you hear names like Bertrand Russell and you put them on a pedestal like they're some kind of great thinkers or not, but then you realize, no, they're not great thinkers. They're just justifying the incredibly greedy elite mentality. All right. This is the introduction by William Engdahl. This book is about a project undertaken by a small socio-political elite centered after the Second World War, not in London, but in Washington. It is the untold story of how this self-anointed elite set out, in Keenan's words, quote, to maintain the position of disparity. It is the story of how a tiny few dominated the resources and levers of power in the post-war world. It's, above all, a history of the evolution of power in the control of a select few, in which even science was put in the service of that minority. As Kennan recommended in his 1948 internal memorandum, they pursued their policy relentlessly and without the, quote, luxury of altruism and world benefaction. In other words, without knightly chivalry. Yet, unlike their predecessors within leading circles of the British Empire, this emerging American elite, who proclaimed proudly at the war's end the dawn of the American century, were masterful in their use of the rhetoric of altruism and world benefaction to advance their goals. Their American century paraded as a softer empire, a kinder, gentler one, in which, under the banner of colonial liberation, freedom, democracy, and economic development, those elite circles built a network of power the likes of which the world has not seen since the time of Alexander the Great, some 3 centuries before Christ. A global empire unified under the military control of a sole superpower, able to decide on a whim the fate of an entire nations. The first book is the sequel to a first volume. This book is a sequel to a first volume, A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order. That's Engdahl's earlier book, of course. It traces a second thin red line of power. This one is about the control over the very basis of human survival, our daily provision of bread. The man who served the interests of the post-war American-based elite during the 1970s and came to symbolize its raw realpolitik was Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Sometime in the mid-1970s, Kissinger, a lifelong practitioner of balance of power geopolitics and a man with more than a fair share of conspiracies under his belt, allegedly declared his blueprint for world domination, quote, control the oil and you control nations. Control the food and you control the people, unquote. The strategic goal to control global food security had its roots decades earlier, well before the outbreak of war in the late 1930s. It was funded, often with little notice, by select private foundations, which had been created to preserve the wealth and power of a handful of American families. Originally, the families centered their wealth and power in New York and along the east coast of the United States from Boston to New York to Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. For that reason, popular media accounts often referred to them, sometimes with derision, but more often with praise, as the East Coast establishment. The center of gravity of American power shifted in the decades following the war. The East Coast establishment was overshadowed by new centers of power, which evolved from Seattle to Southern California on the Pacific Coast, as well as in Houston, Las Vegas, Atlanta, and Miami, just as the tentacles of American power spread to Asia and Japan, and south to the nations of Latin America. In the several decades before and immediately following World War II, one family came to symbolize the hubris and arrogance of this American century more than any other. And the vast fortune of that family had been built on the blood of many wars and on their control of a new black gold, oil. What was unusual about this family was that early on in the building of their fortune, the patriarchs and advisors they cultivated to safeguard their wealth decided to expand their influence over many very different fields. They sought control not merely over oil, the emerging new energy source for world economic advance. They also expanded their influence over the education of youth, medicine and psychology, foreign policy of the United States, and significant for our story, over the very science of life itself, biology, and its application in the world of plants and agriculture. For the most part, their work passed unnoticed by the larger population, especially in the United States. Few Americans were aware how their lives were being subtly and sometimes not so subtly influenced by one or another project financed by the immense wealth of this family. In the course of researching for this book, a work nominally on the subject of genetically modified organisms, or GMO, it soon became clear that the history of GMO was inseparable from the political history of this one very powerful family, the Rockefeller family, and the four brothers, David, Nelson, Lawrence, and John D. III, who, in the 3 decades following American victory in World War II, the dawn of the much heralded American century, shaped the evolution of power George Kennan referred to in 1948. In actual fact, the story of GMO is that of the evolution of power in the hands of an elite, determined at all costs to bring the entire world under their sway. 3 decades ago, that power was based around the Rockefeller family. Today, 3 of the 4 brothers are long since deceased, several under peculiar circumstances. However, as was their will, their project of global domination, full spectrum dominance, as the Pentagon later called it, had spread, often through a rhetoric of, quote, democracy, and was aided from time to time by the raw military power of that empire when deemed necessary. Their project evolved to the point where one small power group, nominally headquartered in Washington in the early years of the new century, stood determined to control the future and present life on this planet to a degree never before dreamed of. The story of the genetic engineering and patenting of plants and other living organisms cannot be understood without looking at the history of the global spread of American power in the decades following World War II. George Kennan, Henry Luce, Averell Harriman, and above all the 4 Rockefeller brothers created the very concept of multinational agribusiness. They financed the, quote, Green Revolution in the agriculture sector of developing countries in order, among other things, to create new markets for petrochemical fertilizers and petroleum products, as well as to expand dependency on energy products. Their actions are an inseparable part of the story of genetically modified crops today. By the early years of the new century, it was clear that no more than 4 giant chemical multinational companies had emerged as global players in the game to control patents on the very basic food products that most people in the world depend on for their daily nutrition: corn, soybeans, rice, wheat, even vegetables and fruits, and cotton, as well as new strains of disease-resistant poultry, genetically modified to allegedly resist the deadly H5N1 bird flu virus, or even gene-altered pigs and cattle. 3 of the 4 private companies had decades-long ties to the Pentagon Chemical Warfare Research. The 4th, nominally Swiss, was in reality Anglo-dominated. As with oil, so was GMO agribusiness very much an Anglo-American global project. In May of 2003, before the dust from the relentless U.S. bombing and destruction of Baghdad had cleared, the President of the United States chose to make GMO a strategic issue, a priority in his post-war U.S. foreign policy. The stubborn resistance of the world's second largest agricultural producer, the European Union, stood as a formidable barrier to the global success of the GMO project. As long as Germany, France, Austria, Greece, and other countries of the European Union steadfastly refused to permit GMO planting for health and scientific reasons, the rest of the world's nations would remain skeptical and hesitant. By early 2006, the World Trade Organization had forced open the door of the European Union to the mass proliferation of GMO. It appeared that global success was near at hand for the GMO project. In the wake of the U.S. and British military occupation of Iraq, Washington proceeded to bring the agriculture of Iraq under the domain of patented GMO seeds, initially supplied through the generosity of the U.S. State Department and Department of Agriculture. The first mass experiment with GMO crops, however, took place back in the early 1990s, in a country whose elite had long since been corrupted by the Rockefeller family and associated New York banks, Argentina. The following pages trace the spread and proliferation of GMO, often through political coercion, governmental pressure, fraud, lies, and even murder. If it reads like a crime story, that should not be surprising. The crime being perpetrated in the name of agricultural efficiency, environmental friendliness, and solving the world hunger problems carries stakes which are vastly more important to this small elite. Their actions are not solely for money or for profit. After all, these powerful private families decide who controls the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and even the European Central Bank. Money is in their hands to destroy or create. Their aim is, rather, the ultimate control over future life on this planet, a supremacy earlier dictators and despots only ever dreamt of. Left unchecked, the present group behind the GMO project is between 1 and 2 decades away from total dominance of the planet's food capacities. This aspect of the GMO story needs telling. I therefore invite the reader to a careful reading and independent verification or reasoned refutation of what follows. And that is the introduction. Pardon me just a second. All right, just a brief review of as many chapters as I can in the next half hour. Chapter 1, Washington launches the GMO revolution. As you know, this was launched in the 1970s. Let's see, early GMO research. The issue of biotechnology and genetic modification of plants first emerged from research labs in the United States in the late 1970s. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration acted in key areas of economic policy in ways which echoed the radical policies of British Prime Minister Thatcher. There was a special relationship between the two, as both were deeply committed advocates of radical free market policies and less government involvement, combining to give the private sector free rein. In one domain, however, that of the emerging field of genetic engineering, some years before, out of DNA and RNA research, Reagan's administration was determined to take a backseat to no one in seeing to it that America was number one. A curious aspect of the regulatory history of GMO foods and genetically engineered products in the United States was that, beginning in the Reagan era, the government showed extreme partisanship in favor of the biotech agribusiness industry. The very U.S. government agencies entrusted with a mandate to safeguard the health and safety of the overall population were becoming dangerously biased. Some years before the first commercial GMO product hit the market in the US, the Reagan administration had been moving quietly to open its doors wide to Monsanto and other private companies which were developing gene manipulated products. The key actor in the Reagan administration on decisions pertaining to the new field of genetically modified products was former head of the CIA, Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, who would himself soon be president, and father of the later President George W. Bush. By the early 1980s, numerous agribusiness corporations were in a gold rush frenzy to develop GMO plants, livestock, and GMO-based animal drugs. There was no regulatory system in place to control the development. The agribusiness companies wanted to keep it that way. The Reagan-Bush administration was partly driven by an ideological agenda of imposing deregulation, reducing government supervision in every facet of daily life. Food safety was no exception, rather, to the contrary, and even if that meant the general population could become guinea pigs for entirely new, untested, new health risks. Wow. So there you go. This is all a big pattern, isn't it? You know, what we're now looking at is new untested health risks of a slightly different sort, but we also feel like guinea pigs once again. And while that resonates, we also have the problem of a lack of government supervision of our power systems and the absence of backups and safety procedures and ways to supplement when bad weather happens, and the apparent recklessness of depending upon wind farms when an ice storm can shut them down. All this stuff is just an indication that government, as has said right here in chapter 1, has gotten dangerously biased and stepped aside to allow, quote, free enterprise, unquote. Well, the most hardened conservative can see that there is a place for regulation, if not just basic criminal law of don't be criminally negligent. Well, I won't try to argue with people that are completely, against all government, but I'm not one of them. I think that there's, I, my wife has a witticism that she says that conservatives think that government is not the answer except for when it is, and liberals think that government is the answer except for when it isn't. Something like that. All right. The next big part of this chapter is the fraud of substantial equivalence. And this is where the George H.W. Bush gets Monsanto in past the regulators by saying, well, GMO food is substantially the equivalent of natural food, so it shouldn't be regulated any different. Well, that's insanity, isn't it? But that's what Bush did, That's H.W. Bush that got that through. So then they start, the next part of the chapter is about the bovine hormones, the RBGH, the bovine growth hormone in the milk, and how all of these things are just turning us into human guinea pigs. Monsanto, of course, just completely dominates the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration. And the next chapter is called "The Fox Guards the Hen House." Well, basically what that's about is how Monsanto's revolving door controls the regulators. And skipping through that chapter, part two is called "The Rockefeller Plan." The Rockefeller Plan, yes, this is kind of like the Bill Gates plan of, why do we need a Bill Gates plan? Why can't we have an official U.S. government plan under the Surgeon General of how we're going to deal with health crises? Well, that's part of what I was talking about with George and Dr. Hamamoto today, was that they are basically trying to convince us that government is incompetent to handle things, and so we need to turn everything over to the corporations, such nice corporations as Monsanto Bayer. So chapter 3, Tricky Dick Nixon and Trickier Rockefellers, it's called. When Richard Nixon stepped into the White House as president in January 1969, the United States of America was in a deep crisis. A very select few saw the crisis as a long-awaited opportunity. Most Americans, however, did not. For the next 6 years, Nixon was to preside over the first major military defeat ever suffered by the United States, the loss of the war in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of American students were marching on Washington in protest against a war which seemed utterly useless. Morale among young American Army draftee soldiers in Vietnam had collapsed to an all-time low, with drug addiction rampant among GIs and enraged rebellious soldiers fragging or killing their company commanders in the field. America's youth were being brought back home in body bags by the thousands. In those days, the Pentagon still allowed the press to photograph the returning dead. The U.S. economy was in severe shock. It was the first time in post-war superiority was being eclipsed by newer and more efficient industries in Western Europe and Japan. By 1969, as Nixon took office, the U.S. dollar itself had entered a terminal crisis as foreign central banks demanded gold instead of paper dollars for their growing trade surpluses with the United States. The post-war profit rate of American corporations, which had peaked in 1965, was now in steady decline. American corporations found they could make higher profits by going abroad and buying foreign companies. It was the beginning of significant American corporate multinationalism, the precursor to the later phenomenon of globalization. U.S. jobs were disappearing in traditional domestic industries, and the Rust Belt was spreading across once thriving steel-producing regions. The post-war pillar of American industrial superiority was vanishing, and fast. David Rockefeller's crisis of democracy. One response by the U.S. establishment inner circles to the late 1960s crisis in American hegemony was a decision to create a new division of the global economic spoils, for the first time inviting Japan into the rich man's club. In 1973, following a meeting of some 300 influential, hand-picked friends of the Rockefeller brothers from Europe, North America, and Japan, David Rockefeller expanded the influence of his establishment friends and founded a powerful new global policy circle, the Trilateral Commission. This triangle included North America, Europe, and now Japan. Among the founding members was Zbigniew Brzezinski and a Georgia governor and peanut farmer named James Earl Jimmy Carter, along with George H.W. Bush, Paul Volcker, and Alan Greenspan, then a Wall Street investment banker. It was no small-time operation. The idea of a new top organization similar to the Council on Foreign Relations, incorporating not only Western European elites, but also Japan for the first time, grew from the talks between David Rockefeller and his main neighbor Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was then professor at Columbia University's Russian Studies Center, a recipient of generous Rockefeller Foundation money. Henry Kissinger was moving to take complete control over the U.S. foreign policy apparatus by 1973. And as both Secretary of State and the President's National Security Advisor, Kissinger was to make food a centerpiece of his diplomacy, along with oil geopolitics. Food had played a strategic, albeit less central role in post-war U.S. foreign policy with the onset of the Cold War. It was masked under the rhetoric of programs with positive-sounding names such as Food for Peace. Often, Washington claimed its food export subsidies were tied to domestic pressure from its farmers. This was far from the real reason, but it served to cover the true situation that American agriculture was in the process of being transformed from family-run small farms to global agribusiness concerns. A secret U.S. national security memorandum. In April 1974, as a worldwide drought and the transformation of America's farm policy was in full gear, Nixon's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Henry A. Kissinger, sent out a classified memo to select cabinet officials, including the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Deputy Secretary of State, and the CIA Director. The title of the top secret memo was Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests. The memo dealt with food policy, population growth, and strategic raw materials. It had been commissioned by Nixon on the recommendation of John D. Rockefeller III. The secret project came to be called in Washington bureaucratic shorthand NSSM 200, or National Security Study Memorandum 200. It was deemed that, should it ever be publicized or leaked, NSSM 200 would be explosive. It was kept secret for almost 15 years, until private legal action by organizations associated with the Catholic Church finally forced its declassification in 1989. After Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandal in 1975, his successor, Gerald Ford, wasted no time in signing the executive order making NSSM 200 official U.S. government policy. Now, that's interesting that it was Gerald Ford that signed it and not Nixon. The U.S. decision to draft the policy came after the 1974 UN Population Conference in Bucharest, Romania, at which the UN failed to adopt the U.S. position. That position had been shaped by the Rockefeller Foundation and most directly by John D. III, and consisted in adopting a world population plan of action for drastic global population reduction policies. A fierce resistance from the Catholic Church, from every communist country except Romania, as well as from Latin American and Asian nations, convinced leading U.S. policy circles that covert means were needed to implement their project. It was entrusted to Henry Kissinger to draft that strategy in NSSM 200. Isn't this remarkable? Okay, they tried to get it through as U.S. policy at the population conference, intentionally reducing global population, and they couldn't get it through with opposition from the Catholic Church then. I don't think they would oppose it now under the current Pope, but at that time, they couldn't get it past the Catholic Church. Well, this is Kissinger's justification. He says, the president has directed a study of the impact of world population growth on U.S. security and overseas interests. The study should look forward at least until the year 2000 and use several alternative reasonable projections of population growth. In terms of each projection, the study should assess the corresponding pace of development, especially in poorer countries, the demand for U.S. exports, especially of food, and the trade problems the U.S. may face from competition for resources, and the likelihood the population growth or imbalances will produce disruptive foreign policies and international instability. The study should focus on the international political and economic implications of population growth rather than its ecological, sociological, or other aspects. The study would then offer possible courses of action for the United States in dealing with population matters abroad, particularly in developing countries, with special attention to these questions. What, if any, new initiatives in the United States are needed to focus international attention on population reduction? Can technological innovations or developments reduce growth or ameliorate its effects? Well, try to get to the meat of the nut here. Food is another concern in special concern in population strategy. Adequate food stocks need to be created to provide for periods of severe shortages, and lesser developed country food production efforts must be reinforced to meet increased demand resulting from population and income growth. To maximize progress toward population stability, primary emphasis would be placed on the largest and fastest growing developing countries, where the imbalance between growing numbers and development potential most seriously risks instability, unrest, and international tensions. These countries are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, and Colombia. This group of priority countries includes some with virtually no government interest in family planning or others with active government family planning programs which require and would welcome enlarged technical and financial assistance. All right, those are the unlucky 13 countries that have been targeted. And as we start running out of time, I run out of the ability to really cover everything that I want to tonight, but let's go to the Brotherhood of Death. Human guinea pigs. Years before Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft made population reduction the official foreign policy of the United States government, the Rockefeller brothers, especially John D. III, or JDR3 as he was affectionately known, were busy experimenting on human guinea pigs. In the 1950s, brother Nelson Rockefeller had invested in exploiting the cheap, non-unionized labor of Puerto Ricans in the New York garment center sweatshops, flying them into New York at cheap rates on the family's Eastern Airlines shuttle. He was also engaged in setting up cheap labor manufacturing directly on the island, far away from prying U.S. health and industrial safety regulators, under a government program named Operation Bootstrap. Operation Bootstrap was launched in 1947 to offer U.S. firms the benefit of cheap labor forces as well as generous tax holidays. At the time, Nelson Rockefeller was Undersecretary of the Department of HEW and a shadowy and highly influential figure in the Eisenhower administration. Poor Puerto Rican women were encouraged to give birth in sanitary new U.S.-built hospitals where doctors were under orders to sterilize mothers who had given birth to two children by tying their tubes, usually without the mother's consent. By 1965, Puerto Rico was a world leader in at least one category. It had the highest percentage of sterilized women in the world. India lagged badly in comparison with a mere 3%. It made a difference when the Rockefeller family could control the process directly without government meddling. John D. III's forced sterilization program was no radical departure for the family. The Rockefellers had long regarded Puerto Rico as a convenient human laboratory. In 1931, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later renamed Rockefeller University, financed the cancer experiments of Dr. Cornelius Rhodes in Puerto Rico. Well, you know the story of Dr. Rhodes in Puerto Rico, right? Where he says that he boasted of killing the Puerto Ricans by injecting them with cancer. In 1961, more than a decade before his policies were to become enshrined in NSSM 200, JDR III gave the second McDougall Lecture to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. He said, "To my mind, population growth is second only to control of atomic weapons in the paramount problems of the day." He spoke of a cold inevitability, a certainty that is mathematical, that gives us the problems posed by too rapid population growth, a somber and chilling cast indeed. Combating the human cancer. Well, Rockefeller supports eugenics, right? We've read all about that in 2 or 3 books now, how eugenics is the tool of the pseudoscience by which they justify extermination of people based on race or disabilities. Chapter 7, Rockefeller and Harvard invent U.S. agribusiness. And that's a story that's really a chapter that's really worth reading, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to skip to the end here. So the last section of the book is called Population Control. It's part 5, and it begins on chapter 12. And this is where we get the combination of the GMO and the population control through that genetic modification. Terminators, traders, and spermicidal corn. By the end of the 1980s, backed by the new clout of the World Trade Organization and with the full support of the White House, the genetic seed giants began to get visibly intoxicated by the possibilities of taking over the world's food supply. They were all working feverishly on a new technology which would allow them to sell seed that would not reproduce. The seed companies named their new innovation GERTS for Genetic Use Restriction Technologies. The process was soon known as Terminator seeds in reference to Arnold Schwarzenegger's crude and death-ridden Hollywood films. As one GMO Terminator backer put it, it was developed to, quote, protect corporations from unscrupulous farmers, unquote, who might try to reuse patented seeds without paying. no matter that the vast majority of the world's farmers were too poor to afford the Monsanto GMO license and other seed fees and had reused seed for thousands of years before. In 1998, Delta and Pineland Seed Company, a U.S. biotech company in Scott, Mississippi, was the largest owner of commercial cotton seeds. With financial backing from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it had won a joint patent together with the U.S. government for its GERT or terminator technology. Their joint patent, U.S. patent number 5,723,765, titled Control of Plant Gene Expression, allowed its owners and licensees to create sterile seed by selectively programming a plant's DNA to kill its own embryos. The patent applied to plants and seeds of all species. Well, skipping ahead a few paragraphs, as soon as the furor around Terminator seeds had vanished from the headlines of the world press, the major gene seed companies, in concert with the U.S. government, began employing increasingly coercive tactics to force GMO seeds down the throats of the world's population, especially in the developing world. Among their techniques of persuasion, the genetic seed companies employed bribery, coercion, and illegal smuggling of their GMO seeds into country after country to, quote, spread the gospel of GMO salvation, unquote. In 2002, the State Department instructed all its aid agencies to act as international policemen. They were instructed by USAID, a government agency, to immediately report to them any opposition in a recipient country to GMO food imports. They were told to collect documentation to determine if the anti-GMO attitude of the local government was, quote, trade or politically motivated, unquote. If they determined it was, then the U.S. government had recourse to the World Trade Organization or to the threat of sanctions against the aid recipient country, usually a potent threat against poor countries. To help Monsanto, DuPont, and other U.S. seed giants spread GMO seeds, the U.S. State Department and U.S. Department of Agriculture coordinated to give emergency famine relief aid in the form of genetically modified U.S. surplus commodities, a practice condemned by international aid organizations as it destroyed a country's local agricultural economy in the process of opening new markets for Monsanto and friends. The European Union issued an official protest against the U.S. government's use of food aid donations used as surplus disposal measures. Washington ignored the protest. The clear strategy of Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, and the Washington government backing them was to introduce the GMO seeds in every corner of the globe, with priority on defenseless, highly indebted African and other developing countries, or countries like Poland and Ukraine, where government controls were minimal and official corruption rampant. Once planted, the seeds would spread rapidly across the land. At a later date, the GMO seed multinationals, using threats of WTO sanctions, would be in a position to dominate the seed supply of the major growing areas of the planet, to give or deny the means of life sustenance as they saw fit. In intelligence parlance, such a capacity was called the power of strategic denial. A potential enemy or rival would be denied a strategic resource, energy, or in this case, food, or be threatened with denial unless they agreed to certain policy demands by those controlling the resource. In San Diego, a small privately owned company, Epicite, held a press conference in September 2001 to make an announcement. Epicite reported that they had successfully created the ultimate GMO crop, contraceptive corn. They had taken antibodies from women with a rare condition known as an immune infertility, isolated the genes that regulated the manufacture of those infertility antibodies, and using genetic engineering techniques had inserted the genes into ordinary corn seeds used to produce corn plants. We have a hothouse filled with corn plants that make anti-sperm antibodies, boasted Epicite President Mitch Hine. At the time of this dramatic announcement, Epicite had concluded a strategic joint research and licensing agreement with the Dow Chemical Company through Dow AgroSciences, one of the three agribusiness genetic seed giants in the U.S. The purpose was to combine Epicite's technological breakthroughs with Dow's strength in the genetic engineering of crops. Okay, so it's just about 9 o'clock, and I want to defer to Mark Kulak, who has a live show starting at 9 over at Housatonic Live. But the point is that they figured out how to put a spermicide into corn. And if you can imagine the effect of that on population, when people don't even know if you eat this corn, you won't be able to have children. That's how far they've gone with this insanity, and we've got to turn it around. All right, thanks for being with me tonight. Be sure and tune into Housatonic Live on YouTube for Mark's latest show. Thanks.